All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for tuning in. Today I have back on for the third time Mr. Jacob Schepis, and it will be really cool to chat with him because as I've been finishing up the volume month and I interviewed some really cool people, we decided that we could extend this a little bit and get some additional perspectives on this topic. So Jacob, thank you so much for taking the time.
Abel, it's a pleasure to be here and honored to be back, man. I've really loved what you've been doing with the YouTube channel and the podcast for a while, and I think, you've stepped up your game and it's been really, really good to see and a lot of very productive discussions happening on your show, man. So just very privileged to be here.
Yeah, thank you, and absolutely, it's cool to chat with you because I've heard you being referenced by a number of the guys that I really respect. I've heard James Krieger reference some of your work in his research review, and then on the famous Lyle McDonald, Mike Israetel debate, I heard Mike Israetel mention some of your experiments with trading volume and things like that. So it will be interesting to pick your brain on all of this. So maybe let's just start with a very general question. Like, how have you been thinking about all this recent uproar about the topic of training volume? Like, it's always been a talking point in the industry, but in the last year or so, it's just have gotten crazy. Like, we've been talking about this much more than ever before. Was this something that impacted your thinking personally, or you were just sitting in the background and sighing a little bit about all of this?
Yeah, it's I think a really worthy discussion because for a long time we didn't really have as thorough an understanding about training volume, specifically for hypertrophy. Like we always knew that intensity and the basic principle of exercise science, progressive overload, like training must get harder over time. Sure, generally that looked like just increasing reps or adding load. We then from freaking scientific management principles, Frederick Taylor back in the early 1900s, his model for planning and increasing efficiency and productivity in the industrial industries was then taken and adopted in to training programs later down the track. We had Hans Selye with the gas model, and that started to influence periodization, and we then saw Matty Evan Pompa and all these kind of people start to talk about how we should plan training, and we had the traditional linear progression models, formally introduced in the 80s and 90s and whatnot. And I think it's been great to see things transform a little bit in terms of exercise science and the discussion in, for lack of a better term, the evidence-based community around how we should approach program design from the perspective of maximizing muscle growth. And I think a lot of the discussions are quite illuminating. They can be confusing if people don't have a thorough and foundational understanding of exercise science and the operations of the different biological systems and the training principles, because at the end of the day training volume is just a variable. It's one of the acute training variables. So it has definitely sparked my interest because I want to get big. I work with a lot of people who want to get big, and I want to get strong, and so do all of my clients. So it plays a role in what I do on a daily basis. So I live and breathe this stuff. So for sure, I've been actively paying attention, trying to make sense of it all, and I think I have a very different role, I guess, to many of the people that you've interviewed previously. Like, whilst they have been practitioners in the past, I'm not a researcher, so I'm doing my best to sort of synthesize all the information and apply it in the real world and trial and experiment with different things to see what works, what doesn't, and I've run into a lot of roadblocks with certain things, but also seen a lot of success with other things, which I'm sure we'll discuss shortly. So, no, for sure, I've really loved all the discussion. I think it's been great, but unfortunately, as you know, Abel, the fitness industry, it's like a pendulum. It swings from one extreme to the other, high volume, high volume, high volume, and then back the other way, low volume, low volume, low volume, and, generally the answer lies in the middle. There's more nuance, it's context dependent, and we can get into that today.
Yeah, and it's really cool to talk with someone who has more so the practical application side of things nailed down more so than the theoretical research side of things. And
Hey! I pay attention to the research, man. Nah, I'm kidding.
yeah, no, yeah, and maybe that is one part where we could start, because like I think it's one thing to discuss whether volume is the main driver of muscle growth. I think that's one thing to discuss from a theoretical perspective. Like, yeah, if we isolate these variables, then it comes out at the end that, yeah, the one variable that if we modify that is the most closely associated with changes in muscle size, that is volume. But it's a different thing playing around with these variables in practice when you're working with people. Like if you're looking at the progress of the people you're working with and your own progress, would you say that it is true in a practical sense? Is volume the main driver of hypertrophy?
Yeah, I don't know if I have an exact answer to that question. And I think sometimes, like, I don't think there's anything wrong with that question. I think it comes from the right place. Like, we're trying to discern, what plays a larger role in muscle growth. Is it intensity or is it volume? We kind of know that frequency, is not a growth stimulus. It's just a way to organize the training variables, intensity and volume over the course of, microcycles, mesocycles, etc., etc. But the way I think of intensity and volume is like this. Intensity is the key to the car. So volume is essentially the engine. And you can't have one without the other, because if you're just, if you have a big engine, but you don't start the car, you don't have sufficient intensities, the car's not going to go anywhere, no matter how big the engine is. And even with a small engine, if you start the car, it will still move. And the engine and how big it is, so how much volume you use, I do see to be like the horsepower of the car, so how fast the car goes, and that can just be seen as how much adaptation you get per unit of volume. So the more volume you do, the more adaptation you get. But that also comes with a cost. So every training session that we do imposes a stimuli. And that results in both like positive fitness adaptations and fatigue, so acute and residual, that can temporarily, mask the expression of these adaptations. So I think you can't have one without the other, and that's a big mistake I feel a lot of people make when they try to determine, is it volume or intensity building muscle? Yeah, it's both. Like both play a role. But yeah, I think that analogy can kind of at least provide a framework for how to look at these two variables. And I've definitely seen, some really good results with increasing volume. So again, I think just to bring the listeners up to speed, we need to remember that the physiological training objectives for hypertrophy are to get sufficient magnitudes of tension and sufficient durations of tension. And the magnitude of tension is like the key to the car, that's the intensity, the absolute load, and the duration of tension is like the exposure or the volume. That leads to a hypertrophy signal, and that will obviously hopefully shift protein synthesis to exceed protein breakdown. And training then needs to satisfy, the absolute intensity requirements so that it is stimulating, or it needs to be close to failure, so the relative intensity, or a combination of both, and then you need sufficient exposure, so volume. But yeah, I've definitely seen great results with some higher volumes, and we see that the literature generally recommends 10 to 20 sets per week per muscle group, and I think that's a pretty decent ballpark average. But for the most part, volume requirements should be individual dependent. Someone who's a beginner, who's never trained before, will go to the gym and everything that they do will be an overloading stimulus. So it will be disruptive, and it will, change their muscle mass settling points. They'll get positive adaptations. So jumping straight into like 20 sets per week per muscle group for a beginner or someone who is using very little volumes, not really training too much, probably not a good idea. So volume should be increased relative to the amount that somebody's doing, provided that they can not only recover from it, but that they can, within an acute sense, but they can recover from it and get more overloading stimulus moving forward. Because volume is a very potent stimulus for adaptation, but it also has the greatest effect on fatigue. So yeah, man, I think volume requirements are super individual. That's a really sort of shitty answer. But I think they're also muscle group specific, and they should be volume requirements should be incrementally changed relative to an individual's baseline requirements without sweeping or overhauling the amount of volumes that they're doing. And there should be more of an assessment and refinement. So basic stuff like a needs analysis, like are you growing? Are you recovering? Are you setting PBs? Are you getting extremely sore? Looking at things, asking really good questions, assessing the answers to those questions, and then refining with small adjustments as opposed to just making these really categorical and silly changes to the program. So I didn't really know if I answered that question, but I thought I'd just provide a bit of a framework before we go into things further.
Yeah, no, that was awesome, and we have a couple of ways in which we could go from here. And maybe first, let's discuss something that I just discussed the other day with a guest, and that is the idea that many people, as you know, will swear by the idea that you shouldn't overthink this whole volume thing. Just get as strong as possible in the medium rep range. Like just as long as you can facilitate progressive overload, you're doing the best you can. And I'm wondering, is that something that echoes your experience? Was the key to making people bigger in your experience is to just get them as strong as possible? And so, yeah, let's just start there and we can go from there.
Yeah, so again, I'm just going to draw this back to some basic physiological ideas that we've started to see emerge in the research, and I'll give a huge shout out. Firstly, I just want to really thank James Krieger, Mike Israetel, and Eric Helms for everything that they've been putting out in relation to the topic of volume for hypertrophy, because much of what I say is my own interpretation of their work, and I try my best not to regurgitate things and just be a parrot of what other people say. But they have been pivotal in my understanding of this topic. So yeah, shout out to them first. And then to speak specifically of like the rep ranges that we're going to see the best growth in, James Krieger's done some really good work that is sort of built upon Chris Beardsley's work. And Buttigieg has also done some work on this. So we've got effective reps, hypertrophic reps, and stimulating reps, and we've started to see that the stimulus for growth is pretty potent across a broad spectrum of rep ranges, but there are some really important differences. But to speak specifically of how we can build muscle upon a wide variety of rep ranges, we can look to some basic concepts such as Henneman's size principle. So when we use high absolute loads, generally like 75% of 1RM or more, we're going to get every rep is going to be strongly hypertrophic out of the gates due to the recruitment of the high threshold motor units. And the higher rep ranges with lower absolute load, so generally anything less than 75% 1 rep max, are only going to be strongly hypertrophic as we take them closer to failure, and we have some fatigue, and those high threshold motor units are called upon. So there is no specific rep range that I think is beneficial for growth. I think you can grow in all rep ranges, and I have seen that in my experience. However, the way that you get the growth is a little bit different, and there are some trade-offs with going to either end of the rep continuum. So, the really low-end rep ranges versus the really high-end rep ranges, and I'll discuss those now. So, this moderate rep range that we generally talk about, such as the 6 to 12 rep range, that's generally going to be your best bang for buck rep range, because you get increased training economy, and what that means is, the last 5 or so reps of a set to failure, so of a 6 or 12 rep max, those reps are going to be strongly hypertrophic. So in the 6 to 12 rep max range, the percentage of reps that stimulate growth is going to be pretty high. So the economy there is pretty damn efficient, right? And you use lower absolute loads, which can preserve joint integrity when compared to the really low-end rep ranges, so 1 to 6 reps. We can build muscle in the 1 to 6 rep range because, again, high threshold motor units will be recruited out of the gate. Those reps will all be stimulating, but we have to increase the total number of sets in order to achieve sufficient dose and volume or exposure to the tension stimulus. That can increase the duration of the session. That has downstream effects within the session and within the microcycle in terms of residual fatigue, because you get a lot of systemic fatigue when you do, you lift with high absolute loads, and that can potentially be problematic from both a time efficiency standpoint, also increase the risk of injury if people don't have their technique dialed down, all those sorts of things. And if we then look to the other end of the rep range, so 12 to 35 reps, we can still build muscle there because we those last 5 reps of a set to failure will be strongly hypertrophic, and that's great. But we have an increased risk of central fatigue. So, if somebody's aerobic capacity is really freaking shitty, they're going to, gas out before they can actually start getting some stimulating reps. The local fatigue isn't going to be the limiting factor. It's that central fatigue, right? And that can be a problem as well. And more specifically, when we're training the really high rep ranges, due to the central fatigue building up, it can be really hard to discern, RPE and gauge that accurately. So I think that's another problem that people can run into. So definitely from a pragmatic standpoint, the moderate rep ranges just make sense for the most part. And if I was to give a percentage of time that we should spend training with a certain repetition range and getting strong there and improving our performance, because that's really the best metric that we have for muscle growth outside of a muscle biopsy, right? Like, not many people are going to put their hand up to do that. And even DEXAs and things like that are nothing more than just guesswork for the most part. It's a really good idea to assess our repetition strength across multiple sets with similar volumes over time. And if we're getting stronger, generally that's a good sign that we build muscle, because a bigger muscle relative to its size can produce more force, and therefore we can lift more weight. So the moderate rep range makes sense, but does that mean the high end or the high and low end rep ranges have no use? Definitely not, because each exercise is self-selecting to certain rep ranges. Like, I am not a fan of performing squats for more than 10 reps. For most people, it's like you can do that, but I think most people just don't have the orthopedic profile, their technique, and the skill acquisition necessary to train in high rep ranges. It's just dangerous. And just in the same vein, I wouldn't do bicep curls for less than 12 reps. You can, sure, but the amount of weight you have to use, it just really hurts my wrist. My elbows get sore. It's just not really comfortable. Some people can do it, sure. Their orthopedic profile, the way they're put together, structurally and functionally, they can do that. Whereas for the most part, I think a lot of people see better results for those smaller muscle groups, isolation exercises for 12 to 20 reps for the most part. And again, those big multi-joint compound movements, more skill, such as your stiff leg deadlifts, your squats, your barbell bench press, anywhere from 1 to 6 reps can be great. Wouldn't go much lower than 5 for the most part. So generally, I like to spend most of my time, 50% of a training cycle, or and that could be a microcycle, a mesocycle, a macrocycle. Generally, a rough recommendation that I sort of abide by is 50% of my time in the moderate rep ranges, and then 25% of my time on either end of that spectrum. So did I answer that question?
Yeah, that was great. By the way, just a random comment. Just recently, I tried doing leg extensions for sets of 8. I think I'm going to stop doing that really quickly because...
Yeah, exactly right, man. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. You can do it, and there's ways that you could manipulate that exercise to make that 8 reps, a little bit more effective in terms of just feeling better. Because if you just bang out 8 reps in a leg extension, you're not going to get a hell of a lot out of that. But if you hold the isometric contraction at both ends for 1 to 2 seconds, and you have a 3-second eccentric, for example, it's like that could be fine, because you might get just a little bit more tension stimulus. Obviously, there's some differing effects in terms of concentric, isometric, and eccentric contractions on the effect that they have, on growth. But for the most part, it's like that's a fine idea. But generally, that exercise, that's going to be better suited to 12 to 20 reps, even higher, depending on the circumstance.
Absolutely. One thing I got to admit kind of annoys me is when people say that, well, don't worry about doing all these accessory lifts and doing all that volume. Let's talk when you can do chin-ups with 50% of your body weight added for 6 reps, or when you can overhead press 220 pounds. And it's like, invariably, the people who say that, A, have really good genetics usually, and B, for most people, by the time they will get there, they will have had to do a lot of volume, and they will also have to train for a number of years already. So it's kind of like you're saying that, well, let's talk when you have been training for a lot of years and you have been doing a lot of volume anyway. So it's like, essentially you're getting to the same place, whether or not you're just trying to get really, really strong in the moderate rep range, or you're actually just chasing volume.
Yeah, no, totally. So in terms of exercise selection, man, this one, I think many people misunderstand, especially for hypertrophy, and they mistake strength for hypertrophy. They're not mutually exclusive, but if you want exclusively hypertrophy, it doesn't really matter what exercise you use. Yes, sure, some exercises are better than others, and I'll talk about that in a second. But this is actually a quote of mine, funnily enough. But hypertrophy is like a tension-dependent process, not an exercise-dependent process. So there are many exercises that you can use, to put tension on the muscle. As a rule of thumb, I think it's a good idea to use free weight exercises for the most part, with your volume requirements for a specific muscle group. And generally, 50% of your volume should come from free weight multi-joint lifts, and I'll explain why shortly. 25%, can come from like machine work, multi-joint lifts, so leg press, things like that. And then another 25% from single joint lifts. And they're not hard and fast rules, but I think that's just a really good framework to sort of look at exercise selection and whether or not you have to perform a certain exercise before you can start including machine work or isolation exercises. Yeah, I don't really subscribe to that idea. Free weight multi-joint lifts, they're great because they work multiple muscle groups simultaneously and they increase efficiency. But the drawbacks of that are that some muscle groups just don't receive optimal stimulus to maximize hypertrophy. For example, the lateral head of the delt, if you want to get good at overhead pressing, you've got to get stronger in the overhead press. But if you want to get bigger and have bigger delts and cap shoulders, well, you probably need to have some lateral raises in there. And also due to the larger skill component, like for most of these barbell lifts, it can take a really long time for people to get strong. And that's going to mean a really long time that they're not getting a lot of stimulus that's going to lead to growth, especially because it takes ages for people to become, neurologically efficient in a lift in a way that they can then optimally stimulate muscle, especially to its full capacity. And generally, we run into the issue of people getting bored, they program hop, they swap out their exercises, so they just spin their wheels. And if they have these hard and fast rules that I can't do this exercise unless I can squat 2 times body weight, or, I can do pull-ups with 50% of my body weight attached to me, all those kind of things, it's like, well, you're going to spend a really long time, detrimenting your gains, put it that way. And also, like, some compound lifts are highly leverage dependent. So, like you said, while some people, can definitely overhead press a stupid amount of weight, it's like if you've got really long freaking arms, good luck, overhead pressing, more than 1.5 times body weight. Like, that probably will never happen. I've got relatively good levers for an overhead press and a barbell bench press. I don't think I've ever hit 100 kilos in an overhead press, but that doesn't mean that I don't do my lateral raises or anything like that. So isolation exercises are great, and so are machines. Machines work multiple muscle groups, just like your multi-joint exercises if they are a compounded exercise in nature, and they're very efficient because it doesn't take long to load up a leg press, especially if it's like a pin loaded. Like, that's fantastic, easy to set up, and you get greater absolute loading like you would in a barbell lift, but with lower skill requirements as well. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, when you're putting together a program, selecting exercises. Your single joint lifts, they're great as well because small learning curve. That means you can get maximal stimulus sooner, you can fill in the gaps from your compounds, and the lower load requirements are often more joint friendly. And that's another thing that I think is overlooked in this volume discussion is, the impact of different exercises on both stimulus and fatigue, because not all exercises are created equally, and 10 sets of squats is very different to 10 sets of leg extensions. And to go one further, if you take both of those 10 sets to an RPE 9, well, I guarantee you're going to have a lot different stimulus, and you're going to have a lot more fatigue with one than the other. So we need to really think a little bit more deeper about the volume discussion and the exercise selection discussion. And I think again, there's a lot of variables that influence the magnitude of stress independent of the dose. So that is the volume, so the mechanics of the movement, like the force vectors, for example, number of joints used, the muscles that stress the most, the distribution of the tension, and the length of the muscle when tension is highest, like the contraction type, whether it's concentric, isometric, eccentric. We know that eccentric contractions are going to have significantly more muscle damage than your concentric contractions, the intensity of load as well, and also like the effort. So I hope I kind of answered that sort of spiel you had there.
Yeah, absolutely. And so speaking of the volume side of things, again, I've heard from a couple of people, and I've heard it from you as well, that you've been playing around with some higher volume experiments for jump starting growth or maybe breaking through plateaus. I've heard this being mentioned by James Krieger and Mike Israetel, like I said. So I would be interested in like how did some of these experiments of yours look like and what inspired them in the first place?
Yeah, so what inspired this little experiment that I've had a couple of little experiments over the last probably 2 or 3 years. Yeah, thanks to James for sort of giving me a platform to talk about this, because he has referenced me a couple of times. And yeah, it's something that I have definitely tinkered with and seen varying degrees of success. But yeah, back in, I think it was, this is going to test me now. What's last year, 2018? 2017. In 2017, I played around with an arm specialization phase. So what I did was I increased my volume on my biceps and triceps, and I ran that cycle for the better part of 10 months, and I made some very, very good gains. And, you know, I'm sure some of the listeners might have seen the progress and I guess the before and after picture that has been floating around the internet on James's website and stuff. But yeah, it was very, very productive, and it highlighted to me that, man, this volume thing, there's something to it. And I guess first, there were a lot of mistakes that I made in my previous arm training, which kind of led to this rapid growth spurt, right? So it's not like I'm just this genius programmer, or that volume was like this magic, silver bullet. I'd done powerlifting in 2016, which meant that I was training my arms once a week with 3 to 6 sets, so maintenance volumes at best. And I had like one exercise for the biceps, and I had 2 to 3 exercises for the triceps, because obviously in powerlifting you have obviously more pressing requirements, you need stronger triceps, so I was doing a little bit more direct tricep work. But the mistakes in these programs, I guess, from a hypertrophy standpoint, was that I wasn't doing much at all, and I was looking to progress load and reps, and I didn't really have any other sort of progression schemes in place. But then what I did do when I got into this arm specialization phase was that I started to slowly increase my direct arm training stimulus, and I started to split that across 3 to 5 sessions per week. And what I did there was not only did I use more volume, so I started to get up to, I worked up from literally like 8, I think, in the first mesocycle, and then it was 10, 12, and I think I got up to around 15 sets for biceps and tricep. This is direct training, so there was probably a little bit more from the indirect stuff, which I'll talk about shortly. But I split this up over 3 to 5 sessions, so I was doing maybe 4 sets for biceps each session. So, we know through some of James Krieger's in-house meta-analytic data that there seems to be this like per session cap for volume with plateau and regression after 10 sets for a muscle group within a single session. So I never sort of exceeded that, which I didn't really know at the time, but it made sense, because I was like, well, I can't do 10 sets of biceps in one session and 10 sets of triceps and get some other training in, and only do that twice a week. Like, that's just flogging a dead horse. Like, I intuitively knew that because I've trained for a very long time and I've trained a lot of people, and doing that much direct bicep work in a single session after you've done a couple of rowing exercises, maybe some pull downs or something like that, it just didn't make sense to me. So anyway, that was like the basic setup. But most importantly was that I varied the exercises within the microcycle from session to session. So I didn't perform the same exercises from one session to the next. I incorporated a wider variety of exercises. So I had single arm high cable curls for my biceps, which was training the biceps in shoulder flexion, which is a very different stimulus to when you train them in shoulder extension with your inclined dumbbell, your inclined dumbbell curls. The inclined dumbbell curls are way more fatiguing, a little bit more stressful on the shoulders. And then I had some other dumbbell and barbell variations in there. And then for the triceps, very similar kind of setup. I had overhead extension work, so in shoulder flexion, which, yeah, a little bit more fatiguing, but it gets a bit more of the long head. And then I had my push downs in shoulder extension, and that gets slightly a little bit more of the lateral head and the medial head, for example. But most importantly, my hand positions were always changing, and I used a lot of the stirrups. So again, basic gym terminology, the stirrups are like the handles that are very flexible, so your hands aren't fixed into a certain position. And this was really important because later down the track, I tried to replicate a similar arm specialization phase, and I was lazy and I just used barbells and easy bars. And within like 6 weeks, holy shit, my wrists, my elbows, and my shoulders were absolutely cooked. And it just highlighted to me that, again, not all volume is created equally, and there are so many other important factors that we need to think about when we look at a program outside of volume. It's like volume's important, sure, but it's like it's only as important as your ability to get that tension to the muscle without causing a shit ton of connective tissue stress, systemic fatigue, residual fatigue that impairs subsequent training sessions and your ability to provide an overloading stimulus, all that kind of stuff. So anyway, it was really cool, and yeah, I learned a lot. And the primary thing that I did in that arm specialization phase was focus on rep progression. So I focused on adding reps and meeting my relative RPE. So my sets were slowly ramped up, not in a weekly fashion, a la Mike Israetel. It was more of a, cool, I'm going to try this, keep it there, try to add reps, meet my relative intensities, and when I feel like I'm plateauing or I'm just not growing, or the stimulus is just not as potent as what it was, and I'm recovering okay, I'm not too sore, all those sorts of things, and I've got time for it. I think that's a really often overlooked component of adding volume. It's like, do you have fucking time to do it and have a life outside of the gym? I'll add in just a little bit more. And I did that, and yeah, holy crap, man, I got some really good games. I got actually called out in 2012 for having really small arms on social media. Like, someone actually said, like, you don't even lift because my biceps were so small. And by the end of this freaking, like, it was 10 months, that I ran this thing for, people were questioning whether I was natty. So it was pretty cool. But then to sort of, and mind you, I was in a calorie surplus this entire time. I was not dieting. I had a pretty good life situation in terms of my work, my family life. I had little children who were, basically, they were not needing their dad much. I could just go to work, go train, and, give my partner a chop out when I needed to. Life was in a pretty good spot. Fast forward to last year, and holy shit, my life, my stress was not in the same place. And I couldn't train with those kind of volumes, and I wasn't recovering. So, it's really context dependent. But anyway, a really cool piece of anecdote that I sort of realized last year, that when I was beginning working with Brian Miner for some powerlifting, and again, slightly different goals, but, and I knew this as well, but he was the one who really brought it to my attention, was that my legs do not require much volume to progress at all. I was using between 6 to 9 sets for my quads per week for quite a while, and I was making linear progressions in my repetition strength in the moderate rep ranges. Like, I was, squatting 200 kilos for reps, my hack squats were going up, and he's just like, holy shit, man, your legs grow like weeds, and your upper body grows like a cactus. And my bench press, we had to keep titrating, volume in, because, like, it just didn't fucking grow. Like, it just wasn't getting stronger. My bench press was stalled. I had to add more, and then we finally busted through. But again, it just goes to show that not only is it context dependent, like your nutrition, your stress, your time availability, but it's also muscle group dependent. Some muscle groups that just seem, to me, not only with my own anecdote, but all my clients that I've worked with, some people just have muscles that grow a little bit better and don't need as much, and they have others that are a little bit more stubborn. And potentially for those stubborn muscle groups, a little bit more volume seems to be a good choice, provided that those exercises you're using to get that volume don't have significant trade-offs or implications for your ability to put that tension from that volume on that muscle, and you can get some good pumps, you can get the stimulus where it needs to go, and you can recover and overload that stimulus moving forward. So yeah, I guess that's it. If you've got questions on that, we can sort of talk about that, man.
Yeah, a lot of cool things to pick up on there. But one note that I want to make is that it's interesting that you mentioned that your legs are a body part that just don't require that much volume, because it's pretty evident looking at your pictures that your quads are one of your best body part. And it's interesting because oftentimes the people that are big and natural, oftentimes they don't do a lot of volume. And I guess there is a relationship there potentially that these people just have a low threshold for volume. Like I'm thinking here of people like Jeff Alberts, Martin Burkhan, who I think there's a very good chance that they are natural, or at least I do believe that they are natural. Anyway, they don't do a lot of volume, and they are, have a bigger natural muscularity than most people will ever have. And that's the case for you and your quads, for example. And then for your upper body, you require more volume. So that's just an interesting confirmation there of that phenomenon, right?
Yeah, exactly, man. I think we've seen that quite a lot. I had a client in a contest prep last year, Abel. This is a really cool piece of anecdote. So he was intending to compete in men's physique. So he was going to wear board shorts, which meant that he didn't really need to have his legs. But he'd worked with me for nearly a year and a half in the off season, and we'd always trained, legs 2 times a week, and it was never a huge focus, but he liked to train legs. He came from a really athletic background. He's got pretty good genetics, not fantastic, but pretty decent. Like, he's got a long frame, but some pretty decent muscle mass, for where he's at in his training career. And in his contest prep, I tried to be creative with how I put together the program, and I thought, well, we don't need you to have legs, so let's free up some adaptive currency and train your legs just once a week to sort of break things up, and we can then have more resources to go towards maintaining and preserving tissue in his upper body, which was a little bit behind his lower body development. Well, it turns out training his legs once a week with anywhere from 5 to 8 sets per muscle group within that week, he maintained nearly all of his leg size, so much so that it got to 4 weeks out and he was like, dick skin lean, that we said, fuck it, let's do bodybuilding. And he entered a bodybuilding show as well as a physique show in a different federation on a different weekend. And he won the junior state title in bodybuilding. And he went on to come third in the opens, and he freaking dominated. And he trained his legs once a week. And again, I think, it was crazy. And I think that just goes to show that, there's potentially a genetic component to this muscle retention thing. And hey, maybe when we want to maintain muscle, we don't need to do anywhere near as much as we think. It's more so the insecurity of not doing enough that forces us to do way more. So that was a really cool piece of anecdote that I sort of stumbled across. And it has really, made me think long and hard about, how I approach things for the people and their muscle groups that are really well developed, and those muscle groups that are potentially lagging or a little bit stubborn.
Right. Now, speaking of bringing up a muscle group and doing more volume for your arms, for example, like, how important do you think it is that you keep other muscle groups at more moderate volumes, or maybe even potentially reduce the volume? Or maybe to flip the question around, for how many muscle groups do you think you can kind of increase the volume more drastically over a shorter time frame at one time?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And I would say that it depends on the level of advancement of the individual. For example, I have a lot of bikini girls who are, early intermediates, and they're like, hey, I want to build really big booties, but they're kind of underdeveloped everywhere. And it's like, we can do a little bit more glute work, but we can pretty much keep everything else where it is, because they're not towards their genetic ceiling yet. They got a lot of room to move in that sense. But for individuals who are way more advanced and have lagging body parts, it's probably a really good idea to bring down the volume for their stronger muscle groups, whilst they increase the volume for those lagging muscle groups. And again, this is going to depend massively on which muscle groups they're increasing the volume for, and the implications that has on subsequent muscle groups. For example, if you need to bring up your delts and you want to increase the amount of volume you do on your delts, well, I dare say the amount of pressing work that you're doing is going to have to come down a little bit, because we know that the delts, play a role in our pressing work. However, if you want to bring up, say, your calves, that's not really going to have too many implications on many things. Maybe exercises such as your hamstrings, if you're doing like RDLs and deadlifts and you're getting like tightness, maybe even your squats, getting into deep ankle dorsiflexion if you're always, sore in the calves, can be a little bit of a pain in the ass. But for the most part, that shouldn't be too much of an issue. But again, what I did when I performed this arm specialization phase was I biased the volume from my other exercises towards the muscle groups that I wanted to pick up. And what I mean by that is, instead of doing flat barbell bench press, I did high incline barbell bench press with a closer grip. So there was more tension on my triceps and a little bit less on the chest. So it was less fatiguing on the chest and more fatiguing on the triceps. I also swapped to dips instead of like a flat dumbbell press, again, which is just a little bit more triceps. I then altered my pull-up hand position. I used a supinated grip that, again, a little bit more stimulus on the biceps. Same for my pull downs and my rows. Instead of having like a neutral grip, I did some underhand work. So I really started to push everything towards, my biceps and triceps. And that just reduced the amount of tension that I could get on, my upper back. And without having to reduce the volume per se of those muscle groups, the amount of tension stimulus that was there was slightly reduced because the exercises I chose biased the amount of tension stimulus towards the muscle groups I wanted to pick up. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that's one way to go about it, but I definitely think that if you're wanting a more simplistic approach and you don't have that good an understanding of, kinesiology, biomechanics, human movement, and whatnot, then it's probably just a safe bet to bring down the muscle groups that you're not prioritizing, just ever so slightly. Not so much so that, your training just becomes unenjoyable, because it's fun to train different types of muscle groups. Training one muscle group and having such a heavy focus in every single session, for example, towards that priority muscle group, that can be really monotonous and lead to a lot of, staleness and boredom. Like, how many times can you do a bicep curl without getting bored, right? But that's where variation becomes a little bit more important, because you can maintain the connective tissue integrity, but also the motivation to train. But again, I think it's probably just a good idea to bring the volume down, maybe towards the lower ends of what will lead to a growth stimulus. So if you've been making like slow gains on, say, 10 sets per week for a particular muscle group, and you ramped it up, for example, to like 15 sets per week for that muscle group, and then you say, hey, I want to prioritize another muscle group, instead of jumping back down to 10, you might go to 12, see how that goes. If you find that overall it's becoming a logistical issue to get enough volume for that priority muscle group, or potentially it's impeding your recovery, or there might be some residual fatigue that impairs your performance and the quality of work you get for the priority muscle, maybe bring it down again. But again, it should be this process of assessing and refining, not just adjusting shit for the sake of adjusting it. I think that's a huge problem. When you write a program, you should be sitting down, thinking about what did I do, and think across the time continuum. So think about your previous data, what that's shown you, then use the evidence-based model as like this overarching concept to guide your decision making. So the research, your experience, and your needs. Look at the current context relative to your prior history, using the evidence-based model, and then make projections as to what's going to lead to the best possible outcome. And you can categorize things into 4 really simple decisions that you make. You have a high confidence of a positive outcome, and if you have the available decisions and you think that it's a good idea and that there's minimal chance that it's going to lead to a shitty outcome, then pursue it. If you have high confidence of a negative outcome, maybe that's something you should avoid. And if you have low confidence of a positive outcome or low confidence of a negative outcome, maybe you should consider that. But I think when you're making decisions about what to do with training volume, exercise selection, so on and so forth, a really useful conceptual model that I've sort of come up with is, again, to think along that time continuum, historical data, moving into the current context, project an outcome, and use your individual biofeedback, your experience, and the best available research to inform those decisions that you do make.
Yeah, that was an excellent rundown. And I guess to kind of wrap up slowly here, just out of curiosity, the recent research and data that's came out on volume and its role in hypertrophy, did you modify the kind of starting volumes that you're giving to some of your clients, or at least you're thinking in terms of how aggressively you might be adding in volume to someone's program depending on progress?
Yeah, are you talking about the Barbero paper? Is that the one? I forget the name of it. The one that just came out that had 5, 10, and 20 sets per muscle group within a session, and they saw muscle loss in the really high volume groups over 6 months. Is that the one you're referring to?
No, but I know which one you mean. That one was definitely interesting. I actually, that might be actually a counterpoint to all of this. I meant the classic ones that we've been talking about for months now, the Schoenfeld paper, the Radiali one before.
Yes, cool. It's provided food for thought, but I look at the Schoenfeld paper and I just see so many logistical issues, and it's just not very pragmatic for the people I work with. But in terms of how I go about setting up volume requirements for someone who I just start working with, firstly, I don't just use the research and the recommendations from the research. I look to what they're using currently. And I'm in a position where the people who I work with are generally intermediates, late intermediates, or advanced. So I'm not working with beginners. And I'll assess their current training programs, and I'll see the setup, so the volumes, the intensities, the frequencies, and that's all great. But then I also get lifting footage, so to see their technique on all their lifts and whether or not they're actually making use of the current volumes that they're using. So I think this is, again, a hugely overlooked component of volume recommendations. You could be training with 20 sets for your quads, but if you're squatting partial reps, you're using light loads and you're just, wimping out, you're not getting close to failure. It's like, that's just junk volume. That's not doing anything. And it could be like, oh yeah, he's not making gains. You need to do more volume. That's what the research is suggesting. It's like, no, he probably needs even less volume. He needs to tidy up his technique. He needs to learn how to move properly, because that's what people often forget is that, when we're in the gym, granted it's not a highly technical sport like Olympic weightlifting or something like soccer and football, but at the same time, it's like moving your body is still a skill. You need to have sufficient, proficiency in the movements that you're performing to be able to load them, to be able to stimulate the muscles, and then get growth. So when I'm looking to devise volumes for someone, I want to be 110% certain that they're getting everything right within the session, within the movements that they're performing for a muscle group before I even look at volume. That is the first step that I take before I adjust training volume. If they are ticking all of those boxes, then I will start to look at other factors such as their sleep, their nutrition, their lifestyle, all of that stuff. And yes, if their sleep's good, their nutrition's good, their lifestyle is conducive to making gains, their technique's great, they're executing, they're training well, and their program's not horrible, it's like, okay, maybe they might need a little bit more volume, but you can see how many steps you've got to go through and how many things how many boxes need to be ticked before you go adding volume. So in terms of volume requirements, it's very, very holistic. I hate that word, but the approach I take towards addressing volume requirements for my clients, you can't look at volume in a vacuum. There is so many other factors that influence volume that need to be considered when we have this discussion and we put pen to paper and we say, you're going to do 20 sets for your quads every week, man.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's well said. Cool, man. You dropped a lot of awesome information here. And just for my final question, since I asked this from all the people that I interviewed on this topic, what were your sort of volume landmarks throughout your training career? You mentioned that your quads and your legs in general are responding to lower volumes. So how high did you ever have to go for any given muscle group to make good progress? And then how low could you stay for any of them to still make progress?
Yeah, so I think my legs are a really interesting one because I actually always wanted really skinny legs, Abel, when I was younger because I always had these chunky legs and I used to get chafe and I didn't like them. So I started running and, footballers for Australian rules football have to be able to run really far. They have to be fast, both, in an anaerobic sense, but also have high aerobic capacity, and having big chunky legs isn't really conducive to that. So I always really wanted skinny legs. But then I sort of started training my legs. I was like, hey, I like this, and I'm a bit of a masochist, so I liked the pain and suffering that came with that, mostly because, I had body image issues and just wanted to punish myself, and I thought that I burned more calories training legs, but that's a story for another day. So when I first started training my legs, I thought, I'll burn more calories if I train my legs twice a week. And I thought the whole, hormone response from legs hypothesis was, had credence and all this kind of stuff. So anyway, I trained my legs twice a week and I was using fucking stupidly high volumes. I was using like 10 sets per session for quads and hamstrings. And my legs freaking blew up. And they were just they were huge. But I was training every other muscle group once a week. And my upper body was tiny, right? But then down the track, once I'd sort of built all that muscle and tissue on my legs, when I started using moderate volumes, so maybe anywhere from 10 to maybe 15 sets per week for my quads and my hamstrings, I kept getting really good growth. And then now I'm still, again, eking out progress, albeit a little bit slower, but that sort of suits my lifestyle now because I don't have the time to dedicate towards, 6 sessions a week anymore, really long training. It's just need to be selective, and if I can make gains, I can make gains. That's great. And they're not a weak point, so it doesn't really matter to me too much. I can get away with 5 to 10 sets on my legs. So that's kind of interesting. I don't really know what to make of it as yet. But that's been the time course of my leg training volume. My upper body, as you started to see, was kind of the opposite. I was training with bro splits, just way too much volume within a session. Like I'm talking like 20. I did flat dumbbell press, incline dumbbell press, high incline dumbbell press, low cable flies, moderate or mid-level cable flies, high cable flies. Like I did fucking everything in a session, and because I wanted to get rid of my man boobs, so I trained my chest with like stupidly high volumes, and it kind of grew a little bit, but then I didn't see any growth for years and years and years. Then I started to train for like powerlifting, benching 2 to 3 times a week, and I saw way better growth. My tits just blew up. I was like fucking Pamela Anderson. They were just boom. But yeah, I started to notice with my upper body, higher frequencies with like moderate per session volumes, anywhere from say 4 to 10 sets per session, sort of like, titrating it up and down as I needed, depending on whether I wanted to focus on a muscle, de-emphasize a muscle, all that sort of stuff, has worked really, really well. And I think, the highest I've got my arms up to was like, again, 15 direct sets per week. And that'd be pretty much similar for my chest, my back, and all that sort of stuff, up around 15 to 20 sets per week. And I've seen some great results there for my upper body.
Yeah, super cool to hear. So nothing crazy high, nothing north of 20 sets.
Yeah, not yet. Hopefully never.
Yeah. One random question for the end. You mentioned that for your arm specialization cycle, you've been doing like 4 sets, like 4 to 5 times a week or 3 to 5 times a week. Generally these days, like how many sets for a given muscle group do you like to cram into a single session? And like what would be the minimum number you would recommend, and what would be the maximum number you would recommend?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think the minimum number per session is going to be dependent on, my energy balance state. So if I'm dieting, I generally adhere to Mike Israetel's volume landmarks and the concepts related to how dieting implicates our volume landmarks. So when we're in an energy deficit, we generally see our maintenance volume come up because we see net increases in catabolism, meaning that we're at a higher risk of losing muscle. We need to do more to maintain our muscle, but we also see a reduction in our recovery abilities, so we can actually tolerate less both within a session, within a week. So if I'm dieting in a fat loss phase, I'll generally use 4 to 8 sets per muscle group within a session, and I'll increase my frequency a little bit, again, to offset the potential loss of tissue. So I'll train with like maybe 2 to 3 times a week per muscle group, 4 to 8 sets per session for those muscle groups. But if I'm in a surplus, anywhere from like 3 to 8 sets within a session, sometimes a little up towards 10 sets per session. But again, I see a massive drop off after 10 sets in just my energy levels, man. My focus, I'm like distracted. I'm like, come on, I got shit to do. I got to see my kids. I got to work. It's like, I know I can get pretty damn good results with anywhere from like 3 to 8 sets within a workout per muscle group, generally 2 times a week. When I'm eating at a surplus and I'm carrying a bit of body fat, nice and hefty.
Yeah, excellent. Awesome, man. Thank you so much for dropping all this great knowledge. I pretty much asked you all my questions. Is there something I definitely should have asked you and I didn't?
No, I think you asked some really good questions, man. I hope I answered everything thoroughly and the listeners enjoyed. And yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much again. And so, just please let people know where they can find anything cool that you've got going on, any new projects. I know you have some interesting things coming up and exciting things coming up. So mention everything you wish.
Yeah, thanks, Abel. Let's sell out and plug away. No, I've got a lot going on. I have JPS Education, which is just an offset from JPS Health and Fitness, which is our coaching company. Our coaches are doing a lot of good work. We're actually revamping our online coaching systems now, so we're going to be able to work with a lot more people from around the world, which is really cool. So if you want online coaching from myself or the coaches, I will have a few places available. But apart from that, the education side of things, we've got our mentorship course for personal trainers or anyone looking to learn more about lifting coming up in September. So enrollment's open. We do a bunch of workshops and seminars. I'm actually coming over to the UK, so out to Europe in July on the 14th with Revive Stronger, Steve Hall and Pascal, and Lyndon Purcell from JPS. And we'll be talking all about contest prep. We're also stopping off at Singapore to do a 2-day hypertrophy seminar. And yeah, that's about it from me, man.
Damn, I envy your life.
No, you don't, believe me.
Yeah, it sounds intense and exciting, but yeah, it will be an exhausting trip around the world, but it's going to be satisfying for sure.
No, I'm really excited. Very excited.
Awesome, and thank you so much for doing this, Jacob. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Not a problem, Abel. Thanks for having me, man.